Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of her small corral, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth as the wind carried a fine dust across the Tolithan prairie. The sky was pale and empty, with the faintest streaks of gray drifting like ghosts above the horizon. Her fingers trembled as they clutched the rough wooden rail, not because of the wind, but because of the sight before her. In the center of the colt, no more than a few months old, struggled to rise on legs too thin and too weak for its frame. Its coat, once a promise of soft chestnut, now clung in dull patches to a body too frail and tired. Its head drooped low, eyes dim but still, searching for comfort. Clara's heart clenched each time the young creature faltered. Each breath it drew seemed pulled from some faraway place, heavy and labored and cruelly uncertain. She had nothing else left in this world save for this small dying thing and the folded envelope pressed deep in the pocket of her worn calico dress. The letter it had been left on the kitchen table by her husband Jacob just before he rode out on what would become his last cattle drive. That was nearly a year ago, and in all those long months she had never once opened it. She told herself there would be time later. But the truth was simpler and harder. She was afraid that whatever words Jacob had written would feel too final, afraid that reading them would mean admitting he was gone for good. Now whenever she slipped a hand into her pocket and felt the stiff paper against her palm, she felt both comfort and terror. It was as though Jacob's voice was locked inside, waiting for her to gather enough strength to let it speak. But strength was something Clara had not known in a long time. Her farm was withering like the colt in the corral. The fences sagged, the roof leaked, and the field that once yielded corn now held only weeds. She had done what she could alone, milking the 2 cows each morning, hauling water from the creek, cutting firewood, until her hands blistered. But the debt stacked high, and the neighbors whispered about the widow Whitmore, who refused offers of help or worse, offers of marriage. Some men came not out of kindness but calculation. A widow alone was a chance for cheap land. Clara met each with the same iron refusal. She would not sell, she would not bend. She would survive somehow, though most days the word felt like a hollow promise. The colt was the last gift Jacob had spoken of in his letters before he died. He had written that a friend owed him a foal, and he wanted Clara to raise it with pride, to remember him each time ran free across the meadow. Instead, the foal had come to her sickly, unable to thrive, and she had poured every bit of herself into nursing it. She mixed remedies taught to her by her mother, rubbed its legs when they cramped, kept blankets over it through cold nights. Still the colt weakened, and every morning she expected to find it still and cold on the straw. The thought tore her apart, for she could not bear to lose it too. If the colt died, it would be like Jacob's last wish fading to dust. Clara pressed a hand to her eyes as the wind stung them. She told herself the tears were from the dust, but her heart knew better. She leaned against the fence, whispering words she did not believe. "You're strong, Ash, you'll make it." She had given the colt that name, Ash, because it reminded her of the embers left after fire, weak, fragile, but still carrying the memory of warmth. She whispered again, stroking the rail, "You'll make it, I promise." From the house behind her came the creak of the old door moving in the breeze. The place looked lonelier than ever without Jacob. The porch sagged, the windows clouded over, and the chimney leaned like a tired old man. Clara turned from the colt and walked slowly across the yard, her boots crunching on gravel. She stepped inside, where the scent of dust and wood smoke filled the air. The kitchen table sat in its usual place, worn smooth by years of meals and laughter, but now it felt like an altar to a past she could not reclaim. On it lay the letter. She stared at it as if it might leap up and demand to be read. Her fingers twitched toward it but stopped. Inches away, she drew a long breath, steadying herself before pulling her hand back again. "Not today," she whispered. "Not yet." She sank into the chair, her body heavy from the labor of grief. The room echoed with silence, only the ticking of the old clock breaking it. She imagined Jacob's voice, deep and steady, telling her she was stronger than she knew, telling her to hold on, but the voice was only memory, fading each day like smoke scattered by the wind. Suddenly from outside came a weak whinny. Clara bolted upright, rushing to the corral. The colt had fallen to its knees, trembling. She slid under the fence without a thought, dropping to the ground beside it. Her hand stroked its neck, feeling the dampness of its coat, the frailty of its body. "Come on, Ash," she pleaded. "Don't give up, not yet." She pushed her shoulder under its weight, straining to help it rise, but the colt only sagged against her. She whispered Jacob's name like a prayer. "Help me, please." The sky darkened. With approaching storm clouds and the air grew heavy, the prairie wind carried the scent of rain. Clara clung to the colt, rocking with it like a mother with a sick child. The colt's breath rattled, and for a moment she feared it was the end. But then, with a sudden, desperate effort, Ash pushed against her support and stood trembling but upright. Clara let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming freely. "That's it, boy. That's it." She pressed her forehead to its neck, the warmth of life still. There against her skin, hope flickered, faint but alive like the colt itself, for the first time in months. Clara felt that maybe she could endure, maybe she could carry on. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than ever, a reminder of love lost and love yet waiting to be found. She did not know that soon fate would send a stranger across her path. A quiet cowboy with eyes like the deep earth and hands that could heal what she alone could not, for now it was just her and Ash against the storm, against the loneliness, against the weight of sorrow. But sometimes the smallest flame is enough to keep the darkness at bay, and Clara knew, as she held the fragile colt, that she would fight for it with everything she had, because in saving Ash she might just save herself. The next morning dawned with a heavy stillness across Dry Creek. The storm that had threatened the night before had passed over, leaving only damp earth and a sky washed pale by weak sunlight. Clara Whitmore stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She breathed in the cool air, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the faint whimper of the colt in the Fadvia. Corral. Ash was still standing, but only barely. She crossed the yard quickly, her boots wet with dew and her hands already reaching for him, whispering comfort. She stroked his muzzle, gently whispering, "You're still here. That's all we need to start the day." She was so focused on the colt that she didn't hear the sound of hooves approaching from the east trail. A rider appeared over the ridge, his silhouette outlined against the morning sky. He sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low, shadowing his eyes. A quiet strength hung about him in the way he rode, not rushing his horse, but letting it move steady, as if the road was his companion, not his burden. Clara stiffened at the sight of a stranger. Her neighbors had taught her caution, and experience had hardened it. She didn't trust men who came unannounced to a widow's land. The rider slowed as he neared the corral. His eyes moved first to the colt, then to Clara. He tipped his hat politely, his voice low and even. "Morning, ma'am." Clara tightened her grip on the rail, not answering at once. The stranger dismounted with unhurried ease, tying his horse to the fence. His movements were deliberate, careful, almost respectful. He approached just close enough that Clara could see him clearly. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a dust-worn duster, his boots scarred from long roads. A faint scar cut across his jawline, giving him a weathered look, but his eyes were steady, not sharp or mocking. "I heard tell you had trouble with the foal," he said. "I know horses. Thought I'd take a look if you'd allow." Clara's instinct told her to send him away. Men always came with offers they dressed as favors, but there was something different in this man's tone. No swagger, no persuasion, just a plain offer laid bare. She studied him a long moment, her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "Elias Boone, ma'am. Just passing through. Heard about your colt from the blacksmith in town." Clara hesitated. Her heart beat hard with both fear and hope. She didn't want to rely on anyone, not again. Yet Ash swayed dangerously, his legs trembling. Clara looked back at the colt, then at Elias. Finally she stepped aside, her voice rough. "If you can help him, do it, but don't expect thanks." Elias only nodded quietly. He stepped into the corral, his boots sinking softly into the damp earth. He approached the colt, slowly, crouching low so he wouldn't startle the fragile creature. His hand moved with practiced gentleness along Ash's neck, fingers pressing lightly at tendons and bones. Clara watched, breath held as Elias examined the colt. He murmured something too soft to hear, then looked up at her. "Weak lungs, poor muscle." He ain't had enough strength since the start, but he's got fight left if you're willing to work with him." Clara swallowed hard. Willing her voice steady, "I've been trying. I've done everything I know." Elias nodded again without judgment. He rose, brushing dirt from his knees. "Then let me show you how to keep him through the night. He's not gone yet for the next hour." Elias spoke little but showed her with action. He demonstrated how to mix crushed herbs with warm water to ease the colt's breathing. He guided her hands as she rubbed Ash's legs with steady strokes to bring blood to the muscles. He showed her how to fashion a sling from old canvas to keep the colt upright when his legs gave out. Clara followed his instructions carefully, surprised at how natural it felt to work beside him. The silence between them was not heavy but companionable. Each gesture, each word was simple, focused on the colt, not on themselves. When the colt finally managed to stand stronger than before, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Elias, unsure what to say. He only gave a small nod as though it was nothing at all, just the work of a man who understood life's fragility. He stepped back, adjusting his hat, preparing to leave. Clara found her voice at last. "Wait, you know so much about horses. Why help a stranger?" Elias paused, hand resting on the reins of his horse. His eyes met hers, dark and quiet. "I've seen enough creatures die when a little care might have saved them. Thought I'd not pass one by again." There was something in his words, a shadow of his own past, that Clara did not dare press. She simply nodded, gripping the rail tighter. Elias mounted his horse with that same unhurried grace. He tipped his hat once more before turning toward the trail. "I'll be near if you need." Clara watched him ride away, a strange mixture of relief and longing stirring inside her. His presence had unsettled her, but not in the way most men did. There was no demand in him, no judgment, just quiet strength that lingered. Even after he was gone, she turned back to Ash, who leaned against the rail but looked steadier than he had in weeks. She stroked his mane, whispering softly, "Maybe we'll make it after all." She glanced toward the ridge where Elias Boone had disappeared. Her heart whispered words she did not speak aloud. For the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. The days that followed unfolded slow and heavy across the prairie. Clara rose each morning before the sun stretched its pale fingers across the sky, her body weary, but her spirit stirred with a fragile determination. Ash still swayed when he stood, still breathed with that harsh rattling sound that cut through her heart like a knife, but he had not fallen again, and that was something she held on to like a thread of hope. The memory of Elias Boone kneeling in the dirt, his calm hand steady on the colt, stayed with her like an echo. She hadn't expected to see him again, yet 2 mornings later, when the sun broke orange across the horizon, there he was riding down the trail, quiet as before, hat pulled low, horse moving in that same unhurried rhythm. Clara's first instinct had been to straighten her back and steel herself against him, but when Ash whinnied faintly at the sight of him, her defenses softened. Elias dismounted without a word, stepping into the corral as though he belonged. There he worked without fuss, showing Clara again how to rub the colt's legs with slow circular motions, how to mix the herbs just right so the bitter taste would not keep Ash from swallowing, and how to keep his spirit alive by coaxing him to stand a little longer each time. Clara followed him, her hands clumsy at first, but steadier with each attempt. The silence between them stretched long, yet it never felt empty. The only sounds were the colt's soft breaths, the scrape of boots against dirt, and the rustle of the prairie wind. When Clara did speak, it was in short, hesitant words, questions about what to do if Ash faltered, what signs to watch for. Elias answered in that same even tone, never rushing, never making her feel foolish. At night, when the chill swept in, Clara wrapped herself in an old quilt and sat by the colt in the barn. Elias had shown her how to drape canvas to block the worst of the wind. She lit a lantern and kept it burning low, watching Ash as though her gaze alone could keep him breathing. The letter in her pocket pressed against her side, a constant weight. She had almost pulled it out twice, but each time her courage failed. Instead, she would remember the sound of Jacob's laughter, the way he had promised her a horse that would carry them into better days. Her eyes would sting, but she held the letter closed, telling herself the time was not yet. Right on the third evening, Elias returned again. He carried with him a small pouch of herbs gathered from near the creek and a length of leather strap. He explained how the strap could be tied gently around the colt's chest to support his lungs. Clara watched his hands as he worked, noticing the quiet confidence in each motion. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words held weight like stones placed carefully in the earth. "You got to give him reason to fight," Elias said. "Not just the body, but the spirit too." Clara looked at him, then truly looked, and saw that his eyes, though calm, carried sorrow. Deep as the canyons, he knew about fighting for life, not just in animals, but in himself. Through those days a strange rhythm formed. Elias would arrive in the morning or the evening, sometimes both, never asking for payment, never demanding thanks. He moved through her farm as though he belonged, yet never intruded. Clara found herself waiting for the sound of his horse each day, her heart lifting against her will. She tried to remind herself she had sworn not to trust again, not to lean on anyone. Yet when he was there, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. When he was gone, the silence pressed harder. One night as rain pattered soft against the barn roof, Clara sat beside Ash, humming a lullaby she barely remembered from childhood. Her voice cracked with emotion, and she realized Elias was there in the shadows, leaning against a post. He had come without her, hearing his presence, quiet as ever. She flushed, embarrassed, but he only gave a small nod. "That song keeps him calm," he said. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it before. She looked down at Ash, then back at Elias. The colt's eyes had closed, his breathing steady for once. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt the tiniest seed of peace take root. The letter, though still unopened, began to whisper louder in her mind. Jacob had wanted her to have this colt, wanted her to raise it, and in some way wanted her to keep living. Thought both comforted and tormented her. She would sit with it in her hand at the table, the candlelight flickering over her face, her thumb tracing the crease of the paper. Still she could not open it, not yet. Not while she felt so close to breaking. By the end of the week, Ash stood longer, his legs less shaky, his breaths deeper. Elias smiled faintly one evening when the colt trotted a few steps before faltering again. That smile, rare and fleeting, lit his face in a way that startled Clara. It wasn't the smile of a man pleased with himself, but of one grateful to see life cling where death had almost claimed. Elias turned to her quietly. "He's fighting now. You gave him reason." Clara swallowed hard, shaking her head. "You did?" Elias shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. You were here every night. You kept him breathing. I just showed you." The way the words struck deep. Clara had carried so much guilt, believing she had failed Jacob, believing she was too weak to save anything. But Elias's quiet conviction made her feel something she had long forgotten, the possibility that she was strong enough after all. As the days stretched on, the bond between them deepened, though neither named it. They spoke of the colt, of the land of small things that filled the silence, but never of themselves, not yet. Still Clara felt the walls around, her heart bending, and though it frightened her, it also warmed her like the first sunlight after winter. One evening, as she leaned against the corral rail watching Ash nibble at hay, Elias stood beside her silent. They watched together until the colt lay down. Content. Elias's voice came low, breaking the quiet. "Ma'am, I reckon he'll live." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes unbidden. She whispered, "Thank you." Elias shook his head again. "I just reminded him how." He glanced at her, then quickly away. The shadows of his past flickered across his face, but he did not share them, not yet. Clara looked at him for a long time, wondering what secrets weighed on him, and if one day she might be strong enough to carry them with him. That night, when she lay in bed, she pulled the letter from her pocket, holding it against her chest. For the first time, she whispered into the darkness, "Jacob, I think I'm ready." She did not open it yet, but she knew the moment was coming. The colt's fight for life had stirred something in her heart, a reminder that love, though buried in grief, could still live again, and though she did not say it aloud, she knew the quiet cowboy had become a part of that fight. The prairie had a way of warning before a storm. The air thickened, the light dimmed, and the horizon darkened with bruised clouds that seemed to roll like restless cattle. Clara Whitmore felt it in her bones as she hurried about the yard tying loose Shutters and gathering laundry from the line, Ash shifted uneasily in the corral, his ears twitching at the low rumble that carried across the land. Elias Boone had come by earlier that morning, checking the colt as he always did, his quiet hands steadying Clara more than she cared to admit. He had lingered longer than usual, his gaze fixed on the horizon, before muttering, "Storm coming. You'll need to keep him warm and dry." Clara nodded, already knowing, but his words planted a seed of unease. He had looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch before he rode off toward town to tend to whatever business called him away by. Afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the wind carried a sharp bite. The prairie grasses bent low, and the chickens squawked nervously. Clara hauled Ash into the barn, draping the canvas Elias had shown her how to hang and spreading fresh straw. She lit 2 lanterns, their glow casting long trembling shadows on the wooden beams. Ash nickered, weakly shifting his thin legs. Clara stroked his mane, whispering reassurance, though her own heart raced. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping like impatient fingers against the roof as the storm broke. It came with sudden fury. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked so close it rattled the walls. Rain hammered the barn roof, pouring through cracks. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her body shivering not just from cold but from fear. She crouched beside Ash, his breath shallow and ragged. The storm seemed to seep into the colt's body, shaking him with every thunderclap. Clara pressed her forehead against his neck, whispering, "You're not leaving me, not tonight, not ever." The words broke as tears streaked her face, but she kept whispering them like a chant, as if her voice could bind him to this world. The minutes stretched into hours. The storm howled outside, tearing at the land. The roof groaned as if it might give way. Clara's arms ached from holding Ash upright, but she would not let go. Her strength was waning when suddenly the barn door creaked open and a figure stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat. Elias Boone. He closed the door against the wind, his chest rising and falling hard from the ride, but his eyes went straight to Clara and the colt. He crossed the barn in long strides, dropping to his knees beside them without a word. His hands joined hers, steady and sure, taking some of the colt's weight, easing her trembling muscles. Clara gasped his name, though she had not meant to speak it aloud. Elias looked at her, then his voice low. "Don't give up on him. Don't give up on yourself." Something in the way he said it pierced through the storm louder than thunder. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time she saw not just quiet strength, but something deeper, a man who knew what it was to fight against losing everything. She clung to that steadiness, drawing strength from it. Together they worked, Elias adjusting the sling, tightening knots, checking Ash's pulse. He murmured soft words to the colt, words meant as much for Clara as for the animal. "You're strong, boy. You hold on now, you hear me." The storm raged on. Rain leaked through gaps, landing cold against their skin, but neither moved from Ash's side. When the colt sagged, they lifted him. When he gasped, they steadied him. Clara's tears mixed with the rain dripping from Elias's coat. She wanted to break, to collapse into despair, but each time she faltered. Elias's hand would brush hers firm, grounding her back to the fight. His presence was an anchor in the chaos. At one point, lightning flared so bright the barn glowed white for a heartbeat. Clara flinched, pressing close to Ash. Elias reached out instinctively, his hand settling on her shoulder, strong, warm, steady. She froze at the contact, but instead of pulling away, she felt her fear ease. The storm outside was still fierce, but inside, for that moment, she felt a strange calm, as if together they could withstand anything. Hours later, the thunder softened, the rain easing into steady drizzle. The barn settled into quiet, save for the sound of Ash breathing, still labored but steady. Clara slumped back, exhausted, her head resting against the colt. Elias remained crouched, his gaze never leaving the animal. He spoke at last, voice rough with fatigue. "He's gonna make it. He's too stubborn to let go now." Clara laughed weakly, though it came out more like a sob. She wiped her face with trembling hands, looking at Elias through blurred vision. "Thank you." He shook his head slowly. "You're the one who kept him here. I just helped her." For a long moment they sat in silence, Ash dozing between them. Clara became aware of how close Elias was, the lantern light casting Warm shadows across his scarred face, his eyes were softer now unguarded. The storm had stripped away the silence between them, leaving only truth. She felt words rise in her throat, words she wasn't ready to speak, of how his presence had steadied her, of how his strength had given her hope again. Instead, she whispered simply, "I couldn't have done it without you." Elias Boone looked at her with something unreadable in his gaze, then nodded once and leaned back against the post. He didn't press for more, didn't break the fragile peace. As dawn crept pale through the cracks in the barn, the storm finally passed. Clara stood stiff and sore but alive. Ash lifted his head and nickered softly, a sound stronger than any she had heard in weeks. She smiled through her exhaustion, stroking his mane. Elias rose slowly, his tall frame casting long shadows. He adjusted his hat, his voice low. "I'll check on him later. You get some rest." Clara wanted to ask him to stay, to not leave her to. The silence again, but the words caught in her throat. She only nodded, watching him step out into the gray morning, his figure fading into the mist. She sank back down beside Ash, her body trembling from more than fatigue. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the letter Jacob had left. Her fingers traced the edges slowly, almost reverently. For the first time, she thought maybe she could open it soon. Not out of despair, but out of strength. The storm had not only tested the colt's will, but her own, and in the quiet cowboy's steady presence she had felt something she thought had died with Jacob, the possibility of hope. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting its first pale light across the valley where Alana's small ranch sat, nestled between the hills and the wide stretch of prairie grass that rolled on as far as her eyes could see. The dawn was quiet, except for the faint rustle of the breeze against the barn's old boards and the soft, labored breathing of the little colt who had become the fragile heart of her life. She rose early every day with the single determination to see the animal through its weakness and pain, to give it a chance to run in the fields, just as its mother had before tragedy struck. Though her own life had been burdened with grief, she found purpose in the slow and patient work of nursing it back to strength. Jacob, the quiet cowboy, was there as he had been for weeks, showing up each morning without fanfare, without questions about why he came or what she owed him. His steady presence had grown into something she relied upon more than she dared admit to herself, and though his words were few, they carried the weight of calm reassurance whenever he spoke that day. As she prepared a mash of oats and warm milk for the colt, she glanced at Jacob standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the brightening sky, his hat low over his brow. He didn't move to speak right away, only watched her with that quiet steadiness that made her feel both uneasy and safe at the same time. She asked softly, "Do you think he's getting stronger?" Her hands trembled as she placed the bowl before the colt, who struggled weakly to rise. Jacob stepped forward, his boots brushing against the hay, and knelt down beside the animal, his calloused hand resting lightly against its neck. He listened to its breaths the way a man listens to the wind before a storm, and finally, after a pause, he said, "He's fighting, and sometimes that's all it takes." Elena let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her eyes stung with unshed tears because Jacob's faith felt stronger than her own. She whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without him." Jacob's gaze lifted from the colt to her for just a moment, and in his eyes she saw something unspoken, something deep and quiet, like the roots of an old oak tree. He said, "You keep going, you've got more strength than you think." Elena turned away quickly, hiding the rush of warmth that spread through her chest. She busied herself with brushing hay off her skirt, but her hands shook and the brush slipped. Jacob didn't comment on it. Instead, he rose slowly, checked the stall door, then moved to fill a bucket of water. His silence was not cold, but thoughtful, like he spoke through his actions rather than words. The hours of the day stretched long as they worked side by side. He repaired a broken fence rail, she cleaned tack, and together they managed to coax the colt to stand for a few minutes, its legs trembling like reeds in a river, but steadying with each breath. Every time the colt stumbled, Jacob was there, steadying it with a strong hand, guiding it without force. Elena found herself watching the way his hand fit so gently against the fragile animal's frame, a man of strength holding life so tenderly. By midday the sun beat down and they sat on the barn steps drinking from tin cups. Elena spoke softly about the letter she still kept folded in her apron pocket, the one she hadn't yet been able to share. She said, "It's from my brother." The words caught in her throat because even now the memory of his handwriting, his hopes for her life after he passed, filled her chest with both ache and love. Jacob didn't ask to hear it, didn't press her to explain. He only nodded and said, "When you're ready, it'll still be there." She swallowed hard. Her gratitude caught like a lump in her throat, and for the first time in a long while she felt no need to hide her grief in front of someone. The evening brought a soft breeze, and the colt managed a few shaky steps across the stall. Jacob's face softened at the sight. Though he didn't smile much, Elena noticed the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, a shadow of joy that felt like a sunrise. She thought then of how he had come into her life so unexpectedly quiet and steady, and wondered what hurt he carried that made him guard his words so carefully. Later, as the sky turned purple and the first stars blinked awake, Jacob prepared to leave. He placed his hat back on his head, gave her a simple nod, and turned toward his horse. Elena's voice broke the stillness. "Wait," she said. He stopped, turned slightly, his face unreadable in the dim light. She swallowed and whispered, "Thank you." Jacob tipped his hat, gave her a look that lingered just long enough to warm her heart before he mounted his horse and rode into the fading night. She stood there long after he was gone, the colt resting quietly in the barn behind her, her hand pressed over the folded letter in her pocket. And for the first time in years she felt a flicker of something she thought had died with her family, hope. The following days brought a rhythm to Elena's life that she hadn't known since before sorrow had wrapped itself around her like a heavy shawl. Each morning she woke to the faint nickers of the colt, who was slowly gaining strength. Each morning she saw Jacob's quiet silhouette leaning against the fence or tending to the barn. Before she even stepped outside, he was always there, as though he belonged to the land itself, as though he had been carved into the hills and the sky and the silence. Elena grew accustomed to his presence, though she told herself not to rely too much on it. Still, in the lonely hours, when she was mending tack or stirring a pot of stew, she realized how much lighter her heart felt simply knowing that Jacob would return. The colt continued to heal, its once frail body growing stronger, its steps more certain, its eyes brighter. Elena marveled at how the creature mirrored her own journey. Each day she coaxed it to stand, to walk, to trust again, and each day she too was learning to stand after her own losses, to walk toward something new, to trust the world just a little more. One evening, after a long day of fence repairs and tending to the herd, Elena sat on the porch, her hands folded around a cup of tea, the letter heavy in her pocket. Jacob sat on the steps below, sharpening his knife, the sound of steel against stone steady and calm. She watched him for a while, the strong curve of his shoulders, the way he worked without hurry or waste of motion. She thought of the many nights she had sat alone, staring at the folded piece of paper, unable to open it, unable to face the words her brother had left her. Something about Jacob's presence, his quiet steadiness, gave her courage. Finally she pulled the letter from her pocket, her fingers trembling. She whispered, "Jacob, I need to read this." His knife paused. He glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod as though to say, "I'll be here." Elena unfolded the paper, her eyes blurring as she traced the familiar handwriting. "Dear sister," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone," and my chest tightened. As she fought to continue, the words spoke of love, of memories they had shared, of the dreams he once held for her life. He wrote that she should not let sorrow chain her, that she was meant to live fully, to find joy again, to open her heart when love came knocking. He told her to keep faith in herself and to never forget that she was stronger than she knew. By the time she reached the end, tears streamed down her cheeks. She pressed the letter to her heart, whispering his name. Jacob remained silent through it all, but when she lowered the paper, he was still there, his eyes steady, not prying, not judging, simply present. And in that moment she realized the gift of his silence. It was not emptiness, but space for her grief, her words, her healing. She whispered softly, "My brother wanted me to live again." Jacob's gaze softened, though his face remained calm. He said, "Then live, Elena, then live." Those words struck her like a bell resonating deep within. She wanted to ask him about his own story, about the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes, but she sensed he wasn't ready to speak. So instead, she simply sat there in the quiet between them, the night air wrapping them both, the stars overhead stretching wide and endless in the days that followed. She felt lighter, more open. She laughed once in the barn when the colt nuzzled her shoulder, and she caught Jacob watching with something like quiet wonder in his eyes. The laughter surprised her so much that tears followed, but this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of release. Jacob didn't say a word, only handed her a handkerchief and stayed close. The colt grew stronger each sunrise it steps. Sure, its muscles filling out, and Elena took it as a sign that her own heart could grow strong again. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a water trough, she caught herself humming a tune her mother had once sung. Jacob paused at the sound, his head tilting slightly. Then after a moment he said, "You've got a way of bringing light to a place." Elena froze at his words, because they were rare words, tender words spoken from him of all people. She met his gaze, searching for meaning in his quiet eyes. But he looked away quickly, focusing on his work. Her cheeks burned, and for hours afterward her heart fluttered with something she hadn't let herself feel in years. That night when she lay in bed, the letter resting on the knit stand, she thought of her brother's words and of Jacob's presence, and she wondered if perhaps love had already come knocking gently, quietly, without her. Noticing the colt's breathing in the barn was steady. The night sky outside stretched wide, and she closed her eyes for the first time in years with hope. The days stretched into weeks, and the colt grew stronger, its legs no longer trembling when it walked across the pasture, its coat glistening in the sun as though it had never known weakness. Elena watched the young horse run with a lightness that mirrored the slow healing of her own heart, and every time she glanced toward the quiet cowboy standing by the fence, she knew that none of it would have been possible without him. Jacob had become a fixture in her life, not because he demanded it, but because his silence, his steadiness, his way of showing up without expectation, wove itself into the rhythm of her days. Yet for all the hours they spent working side by side, for all the words they shared in the hush of twilight, there was a part of him that remained hidden behind guarded eyes, and Elena, though grateful for what he gave, longed to know the shadows he carried. One late afternoon, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, they worked together, stacking bales of hay. Jacob lifted them with ease, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, while Elena dragged the lighter ones into the barn. They paused to drink water from a bucket, Jacob leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed somewhere distant. Elena sensed his mind was far away and dared to ask softly, "Jacob, what brought you here?" His eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment she thought he might dismiss the question with one of his short answers, but instead he was quiet, too quiet, and the silence stretched heavy. Finally he said, "Not everything in a man's past is fit to be spoken." Elena's chest tightened, but she didn't press. She only nodded and said, "Sometimes speaking doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it means setting yourself free." Jacob's jaw tightened, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He turned away as though her words struck too close. The evening deepened, and after finishing chores he saddled his horse. As if to leave early, Elena's heart ached with the fear that she had pushed too hard. She called after him, her voice breaking, "Stay for supper, Jacob." He paused, his hand on the reins, then slowly let out a breath and tied the horse back to the post. Inside the little kitchen, the smell of stew filled the air. Elena set the table nervously. Jacob sat across from her, his shoulders stiff, the lantern light flickering across his face. For a while they ate in silence, and she feared she had lost the fragile trust he had given. But then at last Jacob set down his spoon, his voice low, rough like gravel carried on the wind. He said, "I had a wife once." Elena's breath caught her spoon frozen in her hand. Jacob's eyes didn't meet hers. He kept them on the wooden table, his words halting. "She was kind. She was the kind of woman who saw through my silence just like you do, but I was too proud, too stubborn to tell her how much she meant, and one day she was gone. Fever took her before I could speak the things I should have said." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Elena's eyes blurred with tears. She whispered, "Jacob, I'm so sorry." His shoulders rose and fell as if carrying the weight of years. He continued, "After that I couldn't stay in the same place. Every fence post, every shadow reminded me of her, so I rode, I worked, I wandered, figured I'd keep moving until the ache dulled, but it never did until now. Elena's heart thudded painfully because his words, his confession felt like a window opening into his soul. She wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, but she held back, afraid of breaking the fragile moment. Jacob finally looked at her, his eyes glimmering with a pain so deep it seemed carved into him. He said, "When I saw you with that Colt, when I saw the fight in you, it stirred something I thought was gone." Elena's breath trembled as tears slipped down her cheeks. She whispered, "Jacob, you're not alone anymore." The words cracked something inside him. Though he said nothing, his gaze softened, his eyes lingering on hers longer than ever before. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of grief shared, full of wounds seen, full of something tender growing quietly under the stars. That night, as he rode away later than usual, Elena stood on the porch, her heart pounding, her hand pressed to the letter her brother had left. She realized that maybe, just maybe, love was not only knocking, it had stepped through her door in the shape of a quiet cowboy who carried his own ghosts and yet still found the strength to help her heal. The colt whinnied softly from the barn. The prairie stretched endless before her, and though her heart was heavy with Jacob's pain, it was also alight with a fragile new hope. The dawn came softer than usual, the kind of morning where the sky blushed with pale rose before the sun had even lifted fully over the horizon. Elena stood on the porch, her shawl around her shoulders, the colt grazing steady and strong in the pasture beyond, its movements no longer fragile but filled with life, each step proof of how far they had both come. She sipped from her tin cup and thought about the letter resting safely folded inside the drawer of her knitstand, her brother's words still echoing inside her chest, urging her to live again, to open her heart when love came knocking. And she realized with a rush of warmth that love hadn't knocked loudly, it hadn't demanded its way in, it had arrived quietly, patiently, in the form of a cowboy who had taught her more than she ever expected. Jacob appeared just as the sun broke free, his horses' hooves soft in the damp soil, his frame steady against the light. He dismounted with the same quiet grace as always, tying the reins and tipping his hat. His eyes found hers across the yard, and she felt the familiar rush in her chest, the one that had begun to feel less like fear and more like belonging. Jacob walked with her into the barn. They worked side by side in silence, the kind of silence that was no longer heavy but alive, filled with unspoken words and shared understanding. The colt nudged at Jacob's arm, playful, bold in a way he hadn't been weeks ago. Jacob chuckled, a rare sound that made Elena's heart leap, and she thought then that her brother's words had been right. She was meant to find joy again when the chores were done. They stood by the fence, watching the sun climb higher, the land stretching wide open before them. Elena turned the folded letter over in her hands, her fingers trembling. Then she lifted her gaze to Jacob and said softly, "I think I'm ready to live again." Jacob didn't speak at first, his eyes steady on hers as though weighing the truth of her words. Then at last he said, simple and certain, "You already are." Elena felt tears slip free, but they weren't born of grief. They were born of gratitude, of release. She stepped closer, close enough that she could see the lines of weariness around his eyes, close enough to see the gentleness that had carried her through. Jacob hesitated, his hand flexing at his side before slowly, carefully, he reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The touch was tentative, as though he feared it might break, but Elena held firm, threading her fingers with his. The world stilled around them, the prairie quiet, the colt grazing nearby, the sun warming their faces. Jacob's voice came low, rough, with something deep. "I never thought I'd find this again, Elena. Breathed, you don't have to wander anymore, not if you don't want to." His eyes searched hers, and for the first time she saw the weight of his past lift, just enough for light to shine through. Then, with the simplest honesty, he said, "I'll stay if you'll have me." Her heart surged. She nodded, unable to speak, tears catching her throat, but her grip on his hand said everything words could not. Jacob lifted his other hand, brushing a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that made her shiver. And in that moment she knew her brother's wish had come true. She was alive, she was whole, she was loved. The colt whinnied as if blessing the moment. The wind swept across the grass, carrying the scent of new beginnings. Jacob leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers, and in the quiet between them a promise bloomed, not loud, not grand, but steady like the man himself, and steady like the love that had grown between them. Elena closed her eyes, let the warmth wash over her, and whispered thank you, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Jacob, to her brother, to the heavens, or to all three. The prairie stretched wide around them, endless and open, and for the first time she did not fear its emptiness, for she was no longer alone. Love had come softly, quietly, teaching her to live and to hope and to love again.